The city smelled like ozone and old blood. Shintaro Goto had stopped noticing it somewhere around week 3 of the occupation. The way soldiers stopped noticing the sound of artillery, not because it went away, but because the brain had a mercy function, a dial it turned down when the volume would otherwise break you. He'd learned that in a field hospital outside of Osaka, sitting next to a man who'd lost both his legs to something that had once been a human being and was now, technically, still moving around. That was the word people kept using. Technically. He crouched behind the collapsed pillar of what had been the Kugami Foundation's eastern annex and counted the shapes moving through the smoke across the street. 3 of them. Maybe 4. The creatures the old man called greed moved differently than humans even when they wore human shapes. Something about the weight distribution, something in the neck, a wrongness that the eye caught half a second before the conscious mind could name it. Goto had learned to trust that half second. It was the difference between alive and technically. He back to the pillar and let out a slow breath through his nose. Behind him, boots crunched on broken glass. He didn't turn around. "Clear on the South Passage," said Akira Date, dropping into a crouch beside him. The man was sweating through his jacket, which meant he'd been running. He almost never ran. Satonaka flagged the roof. "There's a clear line to the sub-basement entrance if we move in the next 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Give or take. The big ones cycle their patrol on the hour. We've got a window." Goto looked at him. Date's face was calm in the particular way of someone who had trained themselves out of panic and was now simply operating on the other side of it. The man had been a field surgeon before all of this. He still carried his medical kit everywhere, which Goto had learned was not optimism but practicality. People kept getting hurt, and someone had to know what to do with that. "President is down there?" Goto asked. "He says he is." Date pulled a burner phone from his jacket. The screen cracked clean across the middle and showed Goto the last message on it. A single line that was somehow still immaculate despite the medium. "Happy birthday, Goto. See what I've made you." Goto stared at it for 3 seconds. "It's not my birthday. It never is with him." Date pocketed the phone. "Ready?" They moved. The sub-basement of the Kugami Foundation's eastern annex had been, 10 years ago, a climate-controlled archive for biological specimens and research artifacts. Now it was a bunker, and it smelled like it. Recycled air and generator fumes, and the particular staleness of a space where too many people had been living for too long. Emergency lighting threw everything in amber. Cots had been pushed against the walls to make room for tables covered in equipment that Goto only partially recognized. President Kugami was standing in the middle of it all, with his arms crossed up behind his back, and the expression of a man attending his own triumphant reception. He was still wearing a suit. Goto couldn't tell if it was the same suit from before, or if he'd managed to maintain a supply of identical suits through the end of the world, and he realized looking at the man that either option was entirely plausible. "Goto." Kugami turned, and he was smiling. He was always smiling, but this one was different. Not the performance of joy that he deployed in public, something quieter and more genuine, with an undercurrent of the particular satisfaction that accompanied something long in the making. "And Date-kun, excellent, we're all present." "Erika," Date said, looking past the president. Satonaka Erika had been leaning against a shelving unit in the corner, with her arms crossed. She gave Date a single compact nod. She'd cut her hair since Goto had last seen her. Shorter on the sides, practical. There was a bruise along her jaw that was 2 or 3 days old. She hadn't mentioned it, and he wasn't going to ask, because they'd all stopped asking about things like that. "What is this?" Goto said. He was looking at the table. The thing on the table. It looked, at first glance, like a modified version of the birth driver. The transformation belt that Goto had been using for the better part of 3 years now. Same general architecture, same casing philosophy. But the modifications were substantial. There were additional ports along the lateral face, new input systems he didn't recognize, and a secondary unit mounted to the right sides like a shoulder pauldron from old combat armor. The secondary unit had its own display, its own metal slots. Stenciled on the side in careful clean characters, X unit, the situation, Amy said, has been described to me many times in the past several months in terms of losses. The area's lost, the people lost, the ground lost. He walked to the table and rested both hands on the edge of it, looking down at the device, with an expression that was almost paternal. Prefer to work in the opposite direction. What do we gain? What becomes possible that was not possible before? What can be built that could not have been built had the world remained comfortable and small? With respect, Godo said, that's not an answer. Gami looked up at him, and the smile shifted slightly. You've always been the more direct one. It's one of your better qualities. What you're looking at is the product of 14 months of work, conducted in 7 different underground locations, using components sourced from 6 countries, assembled by 11 of the finest engineers who agreed to keep working when most people had stopped. It is a modification system for the birth driver that increases output capacity by a factor of approximately 3, allows parallel metal processing that the original architecture couldn't support, and incorporates a harmonic resonance system adapted from the very core metal technology that is currently being used to kill us. Godo was quiet for a moment. You built a weapon using their own biology. I built a tool using the best available materials. Kugami walked around the table and picked up the X unit with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. Godo could tell from the way the president's arms adjusted for the weight. The greed are extraordinarily powerful. The ancient one in particular is operating at a level that the original birth system was not designed to contend with. The mathematics are simple. We need more. This is more. Date had moved to stand beside Godo. His eyes were on the X unit with the particular focused calm of a man running calculations. Integration with the existing driver. That's the purpose of the lateral modifications you're looking at on the base unit. The X unit mounts here. Kugami indicated the right side bracket, and the 2 systems communicate. The birth driver handles core transformation. The X unit handles the extended output, the metal harmonic processing, and 3 new capabilities that Dategun will find professionally interesting. He set the device down and picked up a small case from beside the table. He opened it. Inside, nested in shaped foam, 3 cell metals along with something that looked like a core metal but wasn't quite. The symbol was wrong, the material denser. Arthropod-class resonance components, Kugami said. I won't give you the full technical lecture. Erica has a briefing document for that. What matters practically is that these expand the range of combat applications, allow for a level of precision in targeting that the original system couldn't achieve, and perhaps most importantly, he paused, and the performance came back into his smile, just slightly. They cannot be consumed by the enemy. They're artificially constructed on a base architecture that the greed metal-feeding mechanism cannot process. You can fight without the fear of losing your weapons to the thing you're fighting. The room was quiet except for the generator hum. That was the weakness, Goto said. Not a question. That was always the weakness, Kugami confirmed. A soldier who can be disarmed by the enemy making physical contact with his equipment is at a structural disadvantage that no amount of skill compensates for. I don't like structural disadvantages. I spent a great deal of money and time eliminating this one. Goto looked at the X unit on the table. He thought about the 3 greed shapes he'd seen moving through the smoke outside, and the way they moved, wrong-necked and certain, because why wouldn't they be certain? The ancient Uu had been sleeping for 800 years and had woken up and found, apparently, nothing on Earth worth worrying about. That certainty, that unworried confidence, was the thing that got into people. That was the thing that had made the resistance hard to build and harder to maintain. Not the losses, not the destruction, the enemy's absolute lack of concern. He picked up the X unit. It was heavier than the original modification components, better balanced, too. He could feel the weight settling correctly, like it had been designed for specifically his center of gravity. Which, he realized, probably had been. 14 months, 11 engineers. Of course, Kugami had Goto's biometric profile. You said Datekun would find 3 capabilities professionally interesting, Goto said without looking up. I did. What's the third one? Gami's smile went genuine again, the real one. Structural repair and cellular stabilization. Battlefield applicable, non-invasive. Deployable at range up to 40 meters. Your friend the doctor can keep people from dying while you keep them from being attacked. Simultaneously, If the situation demands it. Date made a small sound. Godo glanced at him. The doctor's expression had shifted. Not much, but enough. There was something complicated happening behind his eyes that Godo recognized, because he'd felt it himself in that field hospital. Specific weight of being handed the tool you most desperately needed at the moment you needed it. After too long without it. That Date stopped. Yes, Kugami said. It is. Godo set the X-unit back down on the table carefully. He looked at Satonaka. You've reviewed the full documentation? Twice, she said. Integration testing was done on 3 prior subjects, all successful. The resonance architecture is solid. She hesitated, which was unusual for her. The output levels are substantially higher than what you're used to. First time you run full capacity, it will be disorienting. That's the word the engineers used. They meant painful. It won't kill him, Kugami said. They were confident it won't kill him, Satonaka corrected, with a precision that was not reassuring. Goto looked at Date. Date shrugged, which from him meant roughly, I've survived worse, and so have you, and we need this so. When, Goto said. The main engagement is in 3 days, Kugami said. He had gone back to standing with his hands behind his back, and the smile had settled into something quieter. Not the performance, not the real one. A third thing that Goto had seen on his face, only rarely, in moments, that the president probably believed no one was watching. Something that looked almost like the weight of it. The intelligence we have suggests the ancient UU is consolidating in the central district. The Greed are coordinating for the first time since this began, which means they believe the battle is essentially over. They are drawing together because they believe they're going to win. He paused. They may not be wrong. But, Date said, AG Hino is also moving toward the central district. Another silence. He's back, Goto said. He returned 4 days ago. We don't have reliable contact. He's operating independently, as he always has. But the pattern of disturbances in the central district is consistent with his presence. He's alive, and he's fighting, and he doesn't know what the ancient UO actually is yet, or what it's capable of at full output. Kugami looked at both of them steadily. He will need support. The kind that keeps him alive long enough to do what he does. Goto thought about AG. The way the man moved toward disaster, with such an absence of self-preservation that it had initially read as recklessness, and then, over time, something else entirely. A specific and deliberate choice to put himself in the place where others couldn't or wouldn't go. Not bravery exactly. Peak. Something more stubborn than bravery. Something that was specifically, impossibly human, in a way that Goto had never quite found the right word for. 3 days, Goto said. 3 days. The X-unit needs calibration to your specific drive frequency. Erica will walk you through that process. Tonight. Date Hyun, I have 3 hours of technical briefing to give you on the cellular stabilization system, unless you'd like the document version. Date said immediately. The document version leaves questions. Kugami nodded, and for a moment, the weight was visible on his face again. That third thing, the one he didn't perform. Then it was gone, replaced by the professional brightness that Goto had been watching him deploy for years, like a tool he'd built and learned to use. Good. Then we have work to do. He began moving toward the secondary room and stopped, turning back. Goto. Goto looked up. The name, Kugami said. The engineers suggested Birth X. I think it lacks poetry. I was considering something else. I find myself deferring to the opinion of the person who will be wearing it. He waited. Goto looked at the device on the table for a long moment. The X-unit. The extended architecture. The 3 arthropod-class resonance components in their foam housing. Tool built from the enemy's own biology, designed to work where the original couldn't reach. Birth X, he said. It's fine. It's accurate. Gami considered this. Accurate, he repeated. Something that is what it says it is, Goto said. That's not nothing. The president nodded. Once, and something shifted in his expression. Small and brief, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking. No, he said. It's not nothing at all. The calibration process took 4 hours instead of 1, because Goto's base drive frequency had shifted over 3 years of field use, and the X-unit's harmonic systems needed to compensate for the drift. Satonaka ran the calibration with the focus of someone doing surgery, making micro-adjustments with tools that looked like they'd been machined from scratch, occasionally asking Goto to hold very still while the reading settled. She didn't talk while she worked. He didn't either. They'd known each other long enough to be comfortable with that. It was nearly 2 in the morning when she set the calibration tools down and ran the final diagnostic. The display on the X-Unit's secondary module lit up green across all indicators. "It's ready," she said. Goto looked at it. "Erica." She looked up. "The bruise." He gestured briefly at her jaw. She touched it with 2 fingers. "Patrol contact outside the Shinjuku perimeter. Got away, the greed that was following the patrol did not." She paused. "I'm fine." He nodded. We're both quiet for a moment, with the weight of how often people said that, and how often it was partial, and how they'd all developed the ability to say it and mean the partial version and have the other person understand. "The cellular stabilization system," she said. "The range is 40 meters. Date-Kun knows the parameters, but in a combat situation, he's going to be close enough to need it himself sometimes." She looked at Goto directly. "Be aware of where he is." "I always am," Goto said. She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. And something in her voice was careful, in the way of someone who had decided to leave a thing at exactly that. He ran the full integration test alone at 3 in the morning, with only the generator hum for company. Test protocol was in the document Tanaka had left him. 6 pages, clear and systematic. He worked through it section by section. When he got to the full output test in step 4, he understood what the engineers had meant by disorienting. It was like being struck by lightning from the inside. The X-Unit's harmonic resonance, running at full output in calibration mode, was not painful exactly. Or it was painful, but the pain was the secondary sensation, the one that registered in the moments after. The primary sensation was something without a name in any language he knew. A full system engagement that went from his fingertips to the base of his skull in approximately a third of a second, and left every nerve in his body, briefly convinced that it was conducting electricity. He went to one knee. He stayed there for 15 seconds, breathing through it. Then he stood up, checked the display, all green, and ran step 5. He thought, while he ran through the remaining steps of the protocol, about what Kugami had said. Not the technical details. Those were in his head now, organized and filed. The other thing. The sentence he'd said about the ancient ooh, moving to consolidate, about the greed drawing together because they believed the fight was essentially over. The certainty, the unworried confidence. He thought about what it meant to face that kind of certainty, with a device built in a basement, by 11 engineers who had kept working when most people had stopped. What it meant to carry tools built from the enemy's own biology back into a fight that the enemy believed was already won. He thought about what that said about humans, that this was the answer. Not to accept the math, not to bow to the structural advantage, but to go into the basement and spend 14 months and build something new and come back up and say, then, let's try this again. He finished the protocol at 4:15. He sat on the floor of the annex sub-basement with the X-Unit in his lap and the generator humming and thought about A.G. Hino walking toward the Central District, alone, not knowing what he was walking toward, doing it anyway, because that was just what A.G. did, and had always done, and would apparently keep doing, until the universe ran out of ways to make him stop. Something that was not quite a smile moved across Goto's face in the amber light. All right then. The 3 days passed in the particular compressed way of time before a known engagement, both too fast and agonizingly slow. Each hour waited with the things that hadn't been said, and the logistics that still needed confirming, and the specific quality of sleep that wasn't sleep, where the body rested and the mind kept working. Goto spent them calibrating, reading, watching the patrol patterns through what remained of the city's camera infrastructure. Date spent them in the briefing room with Kugami, and then, after the briefings, in the sub-basement running integration drills that Goto joined for the afternoon sessions. They didn't talk about what might happen. That was another thing they'd learned, both of them, not as a rule but as an understanding, arrived at somewhere around month 4 of the occupation, that certain conversations were wait, you were better off not carrying into a fight. On the morning of the 3rd day, Tanaka came to find Goto in the corridor outside the main bunker room. "Signal," she said. "Central District. Eastern Quadrant. The pattern's consistent with Hino. He's engaged with at least 2 greed. We think Kizari in one of the secondary swarms. He's been at it for 11 minutes. She paused. He's holding, but not for much longer. Godo looked at her. Date, ready. He's been ready since yesterday. He nodded. He went to get the birth driver. The city was different at mid-morning than it was at night. At night, the destruction was softened. Shapes in shadow. The ruined buildings given back some of their original form by the absence of light to show what was gone. In daylight it was clear and total. The streets of the central district had been open battlefield for 6 weeks, and it showed in every surface. But there were also, in the daylight, signs of resistance. Marks on walls that the resistance network used to communicate. Not graffiti, not tags, but small specific symbols that meant safe passage here, danger there, help available at this address. A language that had been invented in the first month, and refined constantly since, by people who had stopped waiting for an official authority to tell them what to do, and had started inventing the necessary things themselves. Date pointed one out as they moved through an alley. 3 marks at knee height on a burned support column. Safe house, 2 blocks south, he said. Stocked within the last 48 hours. We won't need it, Godo said. No, Date agreed, but it's good to know it's there. They heard AG before they saw him. The specific impact sounds of a greed engagement, different from human combat in ways that took time to learn, but became immediately recognizable. Heavier, more resonant. The vibrations in the ground that preceded the visible event by half a second. It came around the corner of what had been a shopping complex, and found the eastern quadrant, in the kind of condition that suggested the fight had been going on considerably longer than 11 minutes. 2 greed, Kizari, the cat-form intelligence, and a secondary swarm creature that kept shifting shape between attacks, were running a coordinated pattern around a single human figure who was doing things that technically humans weren't supposed to be capable of doing. AG had always operated in the technically not supposed to space, with a kind of cheerful refusal to acknowledge the limitation existed. He was losing. Not immediately, not yet, but the math was bad and getting worse. The coordination between the 2 greed was tightening, and he was moving on instinct. And instinct was going to run out in the next 60 seconds. Godo didn't think about it. He locked the X unit into the birth driver's lateral bracket. The click of it seating correctly was the cleanest sound he'd heard in weeks, and drove the transformation sequence. The X unit's startup, even now, was not comfortable. The harmonic resonance hit like the inside lightning again, shorter than the calibration test but sharper. And he went through it the way you went through a cold plunge. Straight in, don't hesitate. Let the body adjust faster than the mind can object. Kamen Rider Birth transformed around him, and then the X unit's secondary systems came online. And everything went wider and clearer, and about 15% louder than it had before, and the pain settled into background, and he was moving before it fully faded. Date had already gone to flank, which was what Date always did. The man understood instinctively that there was a version of fighting that was about the fight, and a version that was about the space around the fight, and he'd spent years learning to occupy the second one. He moved to put himself between the engagement and a cluster of collapsed debris that a second or third greed could have been using as cover, Earthbuster already in hand. Godo came in from the east. Kizari turned. The intelligence in those eyes was old and cold and absolutely certain. The ancient Uochu's certainty had spread through all of them. The confidence of an apex predator who had not, in 800 years, encountered anything that required it to change its fundamental behavior. That certainty was the target. The X unit's extended output changed the weight of an impact in a way that was difficult to explain to someone who hadn't experienced it. It was the difference between pushing against something and pushing through it. Godo had run all the numbers in the technical briefing, understood the architecture, and still the first real combat contact was a surprise. The way the physical reality of a thing always differed from its description. The greed reeled. That didn't usually happen. AG, who had been half a second from losing ground he couldn't afford to lose, pivoted instead and came back in, and the 3 of them established a triangle that the 2 greed immediately recognized as a different problem than the one they'd been solving. Date's voice in the earpiece calm. Second greed is trying to circle, redirecting. Birthbuster's report was distinct enough that Godo tracked it in his peripheral awareness without looking. Date was doing what Date did, which was be exactly where he needed to be before the situation required it. The second greed's path shifted. Date had also activated the stabilization protocols on the X-Unit's secondary. Godo could feel the system running in a way that was distinct from combat output, a lower register hum that meant the range field was up and operating. E.g. was taking hits. He was also, characteristically, completely unbothered about that in the specific way that he'd always been unbothered, which was not bravery and not recklessness, but something that looked, up close, a man who had decided what he was worth spending on, and was consistently willing to spend it. He caught Goto's eye through the brief opening in the engagement, and something passed between them. Not gratitude exactly, though that was in there. Something more like, yes, I know, let's fix it. The stabilization field caught him mid-engagement. Godo felt the system divert a portion of the X-Unit's output to cover the extended range, and the pain spiked briefly, and he went through it again. Straight in, don't hesitate. The field worked. He could tell from the way AG moved after. Not that the man started favoring himself, that he stopped not favoring himself, which for AG was significant. Kazari broke left. The X-Unit's targeting systems were substantially more precise than the original birth drivers, and Goto was still learning the full range of the adjustment. This was combat, not calibration, teat. And there were things you could only learn in combat. But the fundamental principle was simple, and he'd always understood simple principles better than complicated ones. He cut off the angle. Kazari turned, and for the first time, Goto saw something in those cold ancient eyes that was not certainty. It was the beginning of recalculation. That was the thing. That was what needed to happen. Not the win itself. Not the final defeat of a creature that had been alive for 8 centuries. The crack in the certainty. The moment where the enemy's model of the world had to update, because the humans in front of it were not what the model predicted, were not losing the way things that lose are supposed to lose. Were, instead, doing something new, something built in a basement by 11 engineers who had kept working, something made from the enemy's own technology, turned back against the enemy's fundamental assumption about what this world contained. Date was in Goto's peripheral vision on the right, AG on the left. The secondary greed had retreated, wounded, redirected, no longer a coordinated element in the pattern. Kazari looked at the three of them. The ancient certainty was still there. 800 years doesn't shatter in a single engagement. The beginning of recalculation was also there, and once that started, it didn't stop. Intelligence did what intelligence did. It updated. It adapted. It found the new thing threatening, and it began to treat it accordingly, which meant the easy confidence was over. That was enough. That was the whole point. The greed withdrew. The silence after a greed engagement was a specific texture. All the ambient sound rushed back in at once, the wind and the distant structural settling of damaged buildings, and the sounds of the city that was still, stubbornly, somewhat alive. Goto let the X-Unit's combat systems power down to standby and stood in the sudden quiet with the hum of the harmonic resonance settling back to. AG pulled off his helmet. His face was the same as it always was, not serene, exactly. Settled in the way of a person who had made their peace with their position in the world, and found that position to be acceptable. He had a cut above his left eye that the stabilization field had arrested, but not fully closed. He looked at Goto, and then at Date, and then at the X-Unit. That's new, he said. Yes, Goto said, it hit harder. EG nodded, absorbing this the way he absorbed most things, directly, without drama, filing it and moving on. Kugami? 14 months of work, it figures. Something moved across EG's face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. Is he still wearing the suit? He is. Good. EG looked at the empty street where the greed had been. The Ancient One is in the Central District. He's been gathering the greed, all of them. He's building towards something. We know, Date said. He had come to stand beside Goto, Earthbuster holstered. He was running a field assessment on AG, with his eyes, the automatic doctor's evaluation. The cut above the eye needs sealing. And your left shoulder is showing load compensation that suggests the joint is compromised. AG looked at his own shoulder, mildly surprised, as though the information was new to him. Is it? Sit down, Date said, in the tone that was not a request. AG sat down on a chunk of structural debris. Date knelt in front of him and opened the medical kit he always carried, and Godo watched Date's hands move with the precision and economy of a person who had spent years learning to do the maximum amount of good in the minimum amount of time, and he thought about what Kugami had said about the cellular stabilization system, that it would let Date keep people from dying while Goto kept them from being attacked simultaneously if the situation demanded it. The way he said simultaneously like it was a feature and not a miracle. The X unit, AG said, while Date worked on the cut above his eye. What does the X stand for? Extended, Goto said. Extended output, extended the capability, extended coverage. Extended, AG repeated. He seemed to be testing the weight of the word. That's about right. Date sealed the cut and stood. He looked at Goto over AG's head, and the look said several things in the compressed language they'd developed over 3 years of operating in proximity to catastrophe. It said, he's holding. It said, we need to move soon. The patrol cycle won't accommodate much longer in one position. It said very quietly, in the register that required the longest acquaintance to read. I'm glad you're here. Goto gave him a single nod, which in the same language said, I know. Me too. Let's go. The ancient AG said. He had stood up, his movements slightly more even now that the shoulder had been addressed. He's not like the greed. He's not like anything I've fought before. He paused. He doesn't think we can hurt him. We can, Goto said. He said it with a flatness that wasn't bravado. Bravado was for people who weren't certain, who needed the statement itself to do some of the work, who said it the way he said things that were simply true and deserved to be stated plainly. The X unit changes the math. Not all of it. Not enough to win alone, but enough. EG looked at him. Enough to make him recalculate, Goto continued. And once he starts recalculating, he's not certain anymore. And once he's not certain, we can find where he's wrong. AG was quiet for a moment. Then, when did you get smart? I was always smart, Goto said. You never paid attention. Something that was actually a smile crossed AG's face, the real one, the rare one. It lasted about a second. Then it settled back into the focused calm that was his default operational state, and he turned toward the central district. The others are gathering, he said. Hina, Chiyoko. There's a group near the old train station that's been holding a perimeter. Civilians, mostly, some of them with enough equipment to matter. He glanced back at Date. They need your kind of help, more than they need my kind right now. We know the position, Date said. So Tanaka flagged it. Good. EG turned fully toward the central district. I'm going ahead. Obviously, Goto said. AG didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He just went the way he always went, without looking back, without waiting for permission or confirmation, into the space that needed someone to walk into it. Goto watched him go and thought, not for the first time, that the hardest thing about operating alongside AG Hino was the part where you had to let him do what he did, trust that the thing he was resilient enough to survive the doing of it. Then he turned to Date. Train station, he said. Train station, Date agreed. They moved through the city, which was broken and continuing to exist anyway, was filled with people who were built safe house networks in basements and marking walls with smalls with symbols in invented language, keeping records and running patrols, and making impossible calculations in favor of continuing. The greed moved through the city too. The city was not theirs. It had never been theirs and would not become theirs. 800 years of absence and then 800 years of sleep had left the ancient UU with detailed understanding of what humans had been and essentially no useful understanding of what humans did when something tried to end them. What they did was this. They went into basements. They built things. They came back up. They kept coming back up. At the train station, and a small resistance unit who had been holding the perimeter for 11 days on inadequate supplies and worse, sleep, and who looked at Goto and Date when they arrived with the particular expression of people who had been maintaining a position of loan for so long that the arrival of support registered first as disbelief and then slowly as something else. Not relief exactly. Relief would come later. if there was a later. This was the thing before relief. The recognition that the position was no longer maintained by only the people in it. Date immediately moved to the medical triage area, which was a corner of the old station lobby that someone had organized with impressive efficiency, given the available resources. He set his kit down and began the assessments, his hands moving, his voice quiet and specific. And Godo watched the faces of the people he was assessing change. The tension that had been in every jaw and every shoulder since Godo arrived, beginning, slightly, to release. Goto stood in the center of the station lobby with the X unit, humming its low readiness hum, and thought about Kugami's face in that third moment, the one he didn't perform. The weight of it, the knowledge of what they were about to attempt, the decision to build and equip and send people anyway. He thought about Date's hands, 14 months of field medicine maintained and then expanded, the stabilization system that now let him do at range what he'd previously needed proximity for. He thought about Satonaka running calibrations at 1 in the morning with the focus of someone who understood precisely what was at stake and was translating that understanding into micro-adjustments. He thought about 11 engineers who had kept working when most people had stopped. The ancient O was in the central district. The greed were gathering. The math was bad. Goto rolled his shoulder, feeling the X unit's weight settle into its correct balance, and thought, there are things you can build in a basement. There are tools you can make from your enemy's own materials. There are 11 engineers, and a man in an immaculate suit, and a field surgeon with a medical kit, and a woman who counts her bruises as operational data points. And together they have produced something that makes the math different. Not good. Different. Different was enough to start with. Outside, through the blown-out windows of the train station, the central district was visible in the early afternoon light. Smoke and towers, and, somewhere in the middle of it, an ancient king who had slept for 800 years and woken up confident that the world was still the world he remembered. Godo found that confidence almost interesting. He was going to find it, very soon. Professionally unfortunate. He activated the X unit's targeting interface. Watched the system run its readiness check. Watched it come back green across all indicators. All extended capabilities online. All arthropod-class resonance components charged. Cellular stabilization field active at 40-meter radius. He checked where Date was. 32 meters inside the field. He checked where the central district was. Then he went to find something to fight.